So, welcome to all who are joining us today from Connecticut, New York, Massachusetts, and Virginia. And to those who might be at some point either watching the videos or are we live streaming? Is that what this is? Live streaming. All right. The Connecticut State Conference meeting. This is the first in person meeting of the conference since before COVID. And we are so pleased you could join us today. I am Afshan Jaffer, president of the Connecticut State Conference and the president of the AAUP chapter at Connecticut College. I want to start off with thanks. An event such as this takes a lot of planning, especially when time and labor are particularly precious these days. And as always, those who are already involved in various kinds of service to the profession are the ones who are called upon or offer their time and expertise to help plan such an event. So first, I want to thank the dynamic Wesleyan University AUP chapter for their willingness to host this important event and to graciously, and thoughtfully facilitate arrangements necessary for an undertaking of this magnitude. A special thanks to Karen Canalia, Administrative Assistant in the Math and Computer Science Department at Wesleyan, who assisted with the event planning, reservations, and accommodations for our out-of-town speakers. The organizing committee met regularly and worked efficiently. This includes from UConn, Mary Gallucci, who also serves as the VP of the Connecticut State Conference. Representing Trinity College and the Center for the Defense of Academic Freedom, we have Isaac Kamola. And representing the Wesleyan University members, we have Margot Wise, T. David Westmoreland, and Jeffers Lennox. A special thank you to David. He's the one right over there. You'll see him walking around all day. He has paid attention to every single detail and thought of things that I had not thought of. So a special thank you to David for everything that you've done. Last but not least, from the organizing committee, we have Flo Hatcher, who is the executive director of the Connecticut State Conference and a force of nature. Those of you who have emailed with her, I still have yet to meet her. I've only ever met her on Zoom, so I imagine it's quite an experience to meet her in person. From designing the program to connecting with our speakers to ensure their needs were met to mailing us everything ahead of time, there isn't an aspect of the day-to-day that she wasn't involved in. Unfortunately, she couldn't join us in person today, but I hope you get to watch this video flow. The organizing committee also thanks the national AUP staff person who always comes through for us, Lateep Kofi, and the Connecticut AFT staff, including Neil Thomason and Matt O'Connor, for providing us coverage for the event today. Of course, we wouldn't have a program without our wonderful speakers. A special thank you to them for agreeing to travel to Wesleyan on this Saturday. Welcome, everyone. Today's program focuses on the theme of defending higher education. I've spent the last few years looking into political interference, censorship, structural racism, and threats to academic freedom in higher education as a member or chair of special investigations for the AUP. Specifically, I co-chaired two special AUP committees charged with looking into the University of North Carolina and the Florida public higher education system for political interference. Most recently, I chaired the investigation into Muhlenberg College for the dismissal of tenured professor Maura Finkelstein for her social media posts, which the college claimed violated their equal opportunity policies on campus. The report should be out by the middle of this month, and I hope many of you will find it useful for thinking about policies and procedures on your own campuses. I focus on policies and procedures on our campuses because here's the cruel reality. Higher education needs defending, but those of us who are on the front lines of fighting for higher education also need defending. The attacks on higher education are at the institutional level and at the individual level, and everything in between. And that makes it hard for us to find our bearings. We lurch from institutional attacks, such as federal funding being withheld or OCR investigations, to disciplinary attacks, such as academic departments being forced into receivership, to attacks on individuals such as faculty being suspended, dismissed, non-renewed, or sanctioned in other formal or informal ways for their scholarship, teaching, or their speech as a citizen. We hope that the workshops and speakers today are able to arm you with knowledge, inspiration, and expertise that help you mount a much-needed defense of higher education, as well as enable you to do the nitty-gritty work of developing sound policies and procedures on your own campuses. In the course of my work for the AAUP, I've spoken to hundreds of people at this point. I have witnessed the fear, anxiety, uncertainty, and terror that come from political attacks and interference into higher education. The Florida report I co-authored ended with the following warning: the survival of the institution of higher education free from political interference and the ideological agenda of autocrats, a cornerstone of democratic societies, hangs in the balance. Being a bystander is no longer an option. This was written about a year and a half ago. We could not have predicted how true these words would ring in our current context. We are gathered here today because we refuse to be bystanders. So thank you all for joining the fight that is upon us and ahead of us. I now invite Wesleyan faculty member Jeffers Lennox to introduce our keynote speaker. Thank you all.
And when I was talking with the organizing committee and we thought about who we might invite as a keynote speaker, the first name that came to my mind was Hamilton Nolan. And I very quickly put my hand up so that I could get that out there in front of other suggestions. I started reading Hamilton's work, I want to say probably 15 years ago when he was writing at Gawker. Hamilton wrote about politics and labor, but he was also an organizer and worked to organize the writers at Gawker in what I think is one of the first efforts to organize new media platforms and the writers that work there. They were successful. Unfortunately, Gawker was sued by Hulk Hogan and then sold to a private equity firm. And private equity does what private equity did. They sold it off for parts. But Hamilton was fortunate enough to be able to take his talents elsewhere. He was a staff writer at In These Times. His work is featured in The Guardian. And more recently, he hosts his own newsletter, How Things Work. And I suggest you all take a minute right now and subscribe to How Things Work. And if you pay, it's not behind a paywall, but if you become a paying member, he may also answer an email when you ask him if he will come and give a talk somewhere. So I encourage you, please do that. Most recently, Hamilton is the author of The Hammer: Power, Inequality, and the Struggle for the Soul of American Labor. This is a book that tells the stories of rank-and-file organizers, their successes, their failures, and the importance of organized labor in the United States. I was drawn to Hamilton because his writing is defined by a sense of anger and urgency, but above all else, by a sense of hope. He looks at what is wrong in the United States, and there are a few things, and his answer is always, organize your workplace. Unions can make a difference. And as we are here looking at the climate for higher ed, I think we need that kind of urgency and anger, but more than anything, the kind of hope that Hamilton brings to these arguments. So please join me in welcoming for our keynote speech, Hamilton Nolan.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jeffers. Very nice introduction. I was looking around, I was like, I'm probably the least well-educated person in this room, so thanks for making me the keynote speaker. Well done. I'm happy to be here. I love AAUP. I covered the labor movement. I think AAUP is one of the unions that's rising to the occasion these days and sort of doing what needs to be done. So I respect what you all are doing quite a bit. Thank you for having me. And I will save some time for questions at the end too, if anybody wants to ask questions. So I'm here to talk about the labor movement. I know all of us who are involved in unions, including me, we all have our own issues. It's very easy to get very head down in our own issues that our own workplace or our own union is dealing with. And it's easy to kind of lose sight that we're all part of this bigger movement, but it's that connection to the bigger movement that makes us more important than just another interest group, that gives meaning to what we all do. And so on that front, there's good news and bad news. And we can start with the bad news because I think it's always good to get the bad news out of the way first. In January of this year, there was a historically bad event in the United States of America, the worst thing that has happened socially, politically, economically to this country, I think, in many, many decades. And you all know what I'm talking about, which is union density fell into the single digits. Union density for the first time in my lifetime, in your lifetime, or for the lifetime of anybody in this room. I don't think we have any 100-year-old people in this room. Union density in America is now below 10%. And it has not been that low in this country for about a century. And there's more bad news. The decline to single-digit union density came after 4 years of the most pro-union presidential administration in my lifetime, and probably in most of your lifetimes as well. So the thesis that having a good friend in the White House will lead to a revival of the labor movement in this country has been definitively proven to be incorrect. That did not happen. And another item of bad news is that the thesis that having a bitter enemy in the White House will lead to a terrible decline in the labor movement may still prove to be correct. At the same time that unions are weaker than they've ever been in modern America, they're also under a greater assault than they've ever been in our lifetimes as well. We come a long way since Dwight Eisenhower, who was a Republican, of course, said in 1952, "Only a handful of unreconstructed reactionaries harbor the ugly thought of breaking unions. Only a fool would try to deprive working men and women of the right to join the union of their choice." Dwight Eisenhower. And Dwight the fool has arrived. And he's brought the unreconstructed reactionaries with him. I think Jeffers invited me to give this speech a few months ago. And in the time since he invited me, a few things relevant to today's topic have happened. The NLRB has been effectively shut down and very well may be abolished as we know it within the next few years. Tens of thousands of unionized public servants have been fired, many of them illegally. 50,000 TSA workers had their union contract declared null and void by an executive order. And then in the grand finale, so far the grand finale, I don't want to get ahead of ourselves, but more than 700,000 union members at a whole range of federal agencies had their union contracts declared null and void, and essentially had their unions declared to be non-existent by an executive order signed by our president, who, by the way, was himself a union member. He was a member of SAG-AFTRA until he got kicked out for being a scab. So that's something that's always a good factoid to know. I was born in 1979. Ronald Reagan fired the striking air traffic controllers at Patco shortly after I was born. And, so for my whole lifetime, that has been considered the worst thing that the federal government ever did to labor unions in this country. Until now, because Ronald Reagan fired about 11,000 striking air traffic controllers at Patco. And Trump has already thrown out the contracts covering well over 700,000, close to 800,000 federal workers. And so, what Trump has already done in a couple of months makes Patco look like a kind of mildly unpleasant bump in the road. And definitely not since World War II, and perhaps before that. I mean, that's how long it's been since we've seen this type of direct, lawless, grotesque assault on the sort of very existence of unions, the existence of collective bargaining by the federal government. And none of us should fool ourselves that this is going to stop with the federal workers or even with public sector workers. It is clear that they're coming for all of us. This is a war on the entire labor movement. And we didn't choose to be in this war. You know, we all have stuff to do. We didn't choose this, but here it is. We're all in it. And the decision for all of us is kind of, are we going to rise up and fight, or are we going to sit back and wait to die? And I understand that it's a little annoying to be in a war on the labor movement right now. You know, we're all busy. You all have classes to teach. I have blog posts to write. We're trying to finish watching White Lotus, and, you know, there's stuff to do. I mean, it's inconvenient to wake up one day and say, you know, it's time to go to the barricades. Because all of us and all of you are not just union members. You are, you know, you have careers and jobs and families and hobbies and obligations, you know, and it's tempting to kind of opt out of this fight a little bit. The fight's going to happen with us or without us. And why should saving the labor movement be our responsibility? And whenever I feel like that, at times like that, I always like to think about the coal miners in West Virginia 100 years ago when they were trying to unionize. They all lived in company towns. And when they wanted a union, the first thing that happened to them was they got evicted from their houses because they lived in company housing. So they had to go take their families and live in tents down by the railroad tracks. And then at night, sometimes the company would run a car down the railroad tracks, and on the car would be a guy with a Tommy gun, and he would shoot up the tents. And so the miners started putting their cast iron pans up against the walls of the tent to catch the machine gun bullets that were being fired at them every night so they didn't hit their kids. And that's how much they wanted a union, you know. So whenever I think that I'm being asked to do something hard, I tell myself it's not as hard as they had it back then, you know? And it's important to say that they won. They won their union. That union was the United Mine Workers, still around today, still alive and kicking. Last year, I went to Illinois. I gave a speech to the Mother Jones Society out there, and I went to an event which was like an annual memorial at a Union Miners cemetery in a tiny, tiny town in the middle of Illinois. And at that, Cecil Roberts, who's the head of the United Mine Workers, was there to give a speech to a whole crowd of retired coal miners. And when Cecil gave that speech, he recalled to them what Mother Jones, who was, of course, a great union activist of the early 20th century, what she had said when she got up to speak to miners right after the Ludlow Massacre. The Ludlow Massacre was in 1914 in Colorado. Striking mine workers, more than 24 of them were killed by guards, by gunmen employed by the coal companies. They and their wives and children as well. And right after that happened, Mother Jones got up and talked to those workers, and she said this to them: "Sure, you lost, but they had bayonets, and all you had was the Constitution of the United States. And let me assure you that any contest between bayonets and the Constitution, the bayonets will win every time. But you must fight. You must fight and win. You must fight and lose. But beyond all else, you must fight." And being a part of the labor movement means that all of us get to enjoy the things that those people won. Generations and generations of workers before us won, including those people that died. And it also means that we have the responsibility to carry on this movement and strengthen it and protect those things and pass it off to the next generation. So right now, the government and corporate allies are trying to take from all of us and from the next generation a lot of those things that the people that came before us won and the things that we're tasked with protecting. And so that's the situation we're in. You know, it's not that bad for us yet. They haven't even brought the bayonets out yet. So we do need to keep that in perspective. But I do think we all need to kind of look in the mirror and say to ourselves, as Mother Jones said, you must fight and win, you must fight and lose, but beyond all else, you must fight. So that said, what's the good news? The good news is that the fundamental case for unions as the salvation of America has not changed. And I think, in fact, everything that is happening now only makes that fundamental case more vivid. And as I talk about that, let me step back a minute and tell you sort of how I got here and how I got involved in all this in the first place. I grew up in Florida. I had activist parents. They were in the civil rights movement, and they moved to Atlanta and became communists. They were the kind of communists where you had to get a job in the factory to organize the proletariat and whatnot. My dad got a job in a Nabisco factory. He always told me about eating the world's freshest Ritz cracker right when it came out of the oven off the line. My mom got a job in a Sophie May peanut brittle factory. She still cannot stand the smell of peanut brittle to this day. It's been 50 years. But I grew up hearing those kind of stories from my parents. So I went into journalism. In 2015, I was living in New York. I was working for a company called Gawker Media, as Jeffers mentioned, which once upon a time was a successful online media company. And that was a time when online media was kind of the hot new segment of the media industry. There was a lot of money and attention going into the online media, the new media, and it was sort of supplanting the old media industry of newspapers and magazines. But one of the differences between the old media and the new media was that newspapers and magazines had been widely unionized for, going back to the 1930s. A long history of unionism in print media, but in online media and new media, there were no unions at all. And in January of 2015, the Washington Post ran a story, and the headline of that story was "Why Internet Journalists Don't Organize." And the story had all these explanations. The structure of the industry is different today. The technology is different today. The economics of the industry are different today. Young workers have different cultural values today than they had back then. Many, many, many explanations. And a few months after that story ran, we unionized Gawker Media. And shortly after we signed our very first union contract, we were sued into bankruptcy by a lawsuit that was funded by evil Republican billionaire Peter Thiel. And our company was bankrupted. We were sold out of bankruptcy. My site was closed. But through all that, none of us lost our jobs and none of us had our salaries cut because we had signed that union contract right before it happened. So very, very quickly, we got a tangible demonstration of the value of that union contract. And when Gawker unionized, it was considered kind of a novelty. It was like a new thing in the labor movement, and people used to ask how we did it, as if we had some secret. And the answer that we always gave was somebody tried. That's how we did it. The Writers Guild of America East, in our case, traditionally a screenwriters union, said, "Hey, here's this new industry. There's no unions in it. Let's try to organize them." They came to us. They talked to us. We ran a campaign. 6 weeks later, we had a union, and after Gawker unionized, there was a wave of unionization swept through online media and also traditional print media. There's been a big union wave over the past 10 years, everywhere from Los Angeles Times to the New Yorker magazine, Condé Nast, Hearst magazines, tons of union drives within the media industry. And we have essentially turned the online media from a completely non-union industry into a union industry in less than 10 years. And, it's that sort of wave of unionization is a smaller version of what is happening in higher ed right now. Continues to happen in higher ed all over the country. So, I mean, when I think back to, that Washington Post story and everything that came after it, one of the first lessons I learned as a union member was don't sit around analyzing why something can't be done. Just try to do it and you might be surprised. And that's something that I think holds true to this day. And I have been writing and reporting on labor for a long time now, but I didn't set out to be a labor reporter per se. I just set out to write about, why is America fucked up? Why do the rich get richer and the poor get poorer? Why is there a millionaire in the penthouse and a homeless guy on the street? Why does money control politics? All the basic questions that those of you who are smarter than me went to school to learn the answers to, but I became a reporter and wrote about it. And I found as I reported on those things over the years, I kept coming back to labor issues because as I followed the trail of causation for all of those big issues, I continued to find over and over again that labor was at the center of it, and worker power and the decline of worker power in this country was at the center of so many of these other bigger issues, and eventually I became a full-time labor reporter because I found labor issues to be at the center of everything that's important in this country. Um, and to pull back just for a minute and touch on the bigger picture, which many of you know, um, after World War II, mid 1950s, the height of union power in this country, 1 in 3 workers in America was a union member. And that level of union density created the greatest shared prosperity that the nation has ever seen. Ironically, created the American Golden Age that Republicans are always talking about wanting to go back to, as they're also trying to dismantle the unions that created it. Um, and, as we touched on today, the figure is less than 1 in 10. So the scale, the absolutely incredible scale of decline of union power in this country from the middle of the 20th century is from 1 in 3 workers in this country being a union member to less than 1 in 10. And at the same time, of course, we've had the age of economic inequality, and particularly since the Reagan era, we've had an explosion of economic inequality in this country, as you all know. There's a famous chart that many of you have probably seen. Chart has 2 lines on it. One line is union density over time, and the line goes down like that. And the other line is the amount of wealth held by the top 10%, and the line goes up like that. And the lines are perfect, almost perfect mirror images of one another. So, it's clear that the breaking of unions enabled and facilitated the rise of economic inequality in this country. And I think of the crisis of inequality as kind of the macro crisis that underlies a lot of our more specific economic and social and political crises that we're all experiencing, including the rise of Trump. And I don't think I need to make that case to a room full of academics, but the unions were killed, the inequality rose, and it made the space for the fascism that we're all living through at this point. And so, as I came to sort of understand these things, I thought about how do you roll back inequality? How do you turn around a crisis as large as the rise of inequality? There's basically only 2 ways to turn back inequality. One way is the government can do it. They can do it through the tax code. They can do it through regulation. They can push wealth down the income chain through policy. If you think the U.S. government's going to do that anytime soon, you're more optimistic than me. And the only other way to really turn around that mechanism is for the working class to gain enough power to reclaim its fair share of the wealth that's produced in the country. And unions, of course, are the tool that workers use to do that. And so when I came to understand that, I came to understand that organized labor, even though it is considered a niche, even though it is not at the center of American politics, even though it has been marginalized in many ways, is still the single most important tool to fix the single most important problem in America. And on top of that macro crisis of inequality, we had the acute crisis of the pandemic. I was a labor reporter, full-time labor reporter throughout the pandemic, talked to workers all over the country who were either in a crisis because they had been thrown into unemployment overnight and they had no safety net, they couldn't access payments, or they were thrown into a crisis because they were told they were essential workers and they were told to keep coming to work and risk their health and risk their lives in many cases. And that experience of the pandemic, I think, radicalized millions and millions and millions of workers all across this country. Even if they wouldn't use the word radicalized, tens of millions of American workers saw very vividly that there was no safety net for them. Their job is not going to save them. The boss is not going to save them. And it was a big contributor to the popularity of organized labor today and the appetite for organized labor today. Public opinion polls say unions are more popular today than they've been in 60 years. 60 years. Tens of millions of Americans say in public opinion polls that they would like to have a union in their workplace. And yet, even with all those ingredients in place, union density continued to go down over the course of the Biden administration, post-pandemic, and for the 40 years preceding that as well. And so the kind of tension between the incredible possibility of organized labor to fix this country and the sort of disappointing reality of organized labor, in many cases, was the seed for the book that I wrote. The book, which I reported the book all over the country, it talks about the good and the bad elements of the labor movement. There are chapters on things which I found to be extremely inspiring. There's a chapter on the child care workers in the state of California who ran a 20-year-long campaign. These are in-home child care workers who take care of people's kids in their houses. Two unions joined together and spent literally 20 years organizing 40,000 of these workers across the state of California. Had to get the law changed during the course of this. I spoke to women whose mother was there when the campaign started. The mother retired. The daughter went into the family business, and the daughter was there when the campaign finally succeeded 20 years later. And they won. And those 40,000 workers have a union contract today. And it's just such an inspiring example of what can be done if unions have a big vision. There's a chapter on the Culinary Union in Las Vegas, which is one of the strongest local unions in this country. This is the union that organized the casino industry in Nevada. They have successfully organized now every single property on the Las Vegas Strip. If you go to Las Vegas, bad things might happen, but you can feel good that you're staying in union property, at least if you stay on the Strip. And what I think stands out about the Culinary Union and what is so inspiring about them is that they've made themselves into one of the strongest political forces in the state of Nevada. If you go to Nevada for the caucuses every 4 years during the presidential campaigns, every single Democratic presidential candidate comes down to that union hall and stands in a room, much shabbier than this room, in front of a bunch of room cleaners and people like that, and they do it because the union built that political power through organizing power and not vice versa. A lot of unions can fall prey to the belief that our political power comes from writing a check to a politician, and this is a union that has made itself extremely politically powerful solely by organizing workers and building that power from the ground up. And I also have chapters on less good things about the labor movement. I have a chapter about one single woman in West Virginia, Elkview, West Virginia, tiny little town. She worked at Tudor's Biscuit World, which is an extremely popular fast food restaurant in West Virginia, and decided that she wanted to unionize her store. Her husband had been in a union. She said, "We need a union here." Little did she know she launched one of the only fast food organizing drives in the country at that time. But ultimately she lost. And the chapter is kind of about why she lost and why it's so hard for regular people to do something that should be a basic right for anyone, which is to organize your workplace. And there's a chapter on the labor movement in South Carolina, which is the state with the lowest union density in America, the most anti-union state in this country. If you think you got it hard up here, at least you're not in South Carolina. And what the labor movement looks like. And there is a labor movement in South Carolina. I remember interviewing the head of the teachers union in the state of South Carolina, and she told me a story about her next door neighbor who she'd lived next to for 10 years. Said, "Hey, my wife became a teacher and she needs some help." And so the woman who was the head of the teachers union said, "Yeah, have her come talk to me, join the union. We're going to help her out." And the next week, the neighbor came back and said, "She won't join the union. She thinks you're the mafia." She was like, "Jim, I'm your next door neighbor for 10 years. No, she thinks you all are the mafia." So it's an uphill battle, but even in South Carolina, there are very powerful unions. There's a rich history, famous strikes, the Charleston Hospital strike. There's an incredibly powerful longshore union down there at the Port of Charleston. So the labor movement can build power anywhere. And throughout the book, I followed Sarah Nelson, who some of you may know is the head of the Association of Flight Attendants, very charismatic, fiery, progressive labor leader, and sort of wrote about how she struggled with the question of how do you become a leader of the labor movement, beyond just trying to lead a particular union. Is it even possible to be a leader of this movement that is so disparate and widespread? And she was considering running for the head of the AFL-CIO at the time I was reporting the book. Didn't end up doing that. If you're curious why, please read the book. But she was a person who came to national prominence in 2019 when she called for a general strike during the government shutdown, the first government shutdown under President Trump. And she came out and said, we need to do a general strike. And that kind of catapulted her to national fame because it was so unheard of for union leaders to say something like that, and here we are now, 6 years later, and talking about the same thing again, and she and other good union leaders like Sean Fain and some of the more progressive union leaders of this country are struggling with the same kind of questions today. Do we need a general strike? What can we do? So it's been kind of a strange experience because my book came out a year ago, and when I look at it now, America is running incredibly fast in the opposite direction of everything that I advocated for in the book. One of the points that I tried to make is that raising union density is like a magical thing that will fix this nation in so many ways. There are so many associated measurements of economic good and social good and political good that come along when you raise union density in a country. And that raising union density is kind of legitimately the key to making America great again, is to raise union density. I think that what a lot of people think they want when they think of the golden age of America, they think we want to bring back manufacturing jobs and things like that. Like, that's not what they want. They want 30% union density, and they want the shared prosperity that came with that. And so instead of pursuing that as the heart of the goal, of course, we're pursuing fascism and slashing union density to try to make America great again. And I think that it's probably not an exaggeration to say that if the labor movement's not able to build some sort of firewall pretty soon, union density in this country could shrink by half, I think, under Trump. Half of the union density in this country is in the public sector. So it's an existential situation for us right now. Another point I made associated to that is that the labor movement needs to invest a shitload of money and resources into new union organizing. And here again, I think higher ed has been, numerically speaking, the brightest spot in the entire labor movement. When you look at the lists of the biggest union drives in America each year, the vast majority of them are in higher ed for the past 5 or 6 years. So you all are killing it. You're doing good. And, I think a lot of America's bigger unions need to look to higher ed and try to shake loose the amount of organizing money and resources to try to replicate the sort of growth that's been going on in higher ed, and spread that. And so, I've said to a couple of people here, but, if you all ever manage to form one big union for higher ed and get in the AFL-CIO, you can pull the entire AFL-CIO in an extremely progressive direction. You all be a big union, and you would be the most progressive organizing union in the AFL-CIO. You could do a lot for the whole labor movement. So, just an idea. And I mean, and when I look at all the grad worker unions on campuses, one of the greatest things about grad worker unions is that many or most of the people in those unions are going to go on to work in other industries. Not everybody is going to stay in academia. They're going to go out all over the place, and everywhere they go, you're going to have these people who have had that experience of being in a union and being in organizing campaigns. And so I think of higher ed as kind of like the Johnny Appleseed of the labor movement. I mean, you all are the ones who are going to spread out throughout the whole economy and the whole country and spread labor organizing everywhere. And so, it's the job of existing unions to give all those aspiring organizers the resources, the money, and the space to be able to organize the new unions that we all need. But I fear that what a lot of big unions are going to do instead during the next 4 years is to withdraw sort of behind their little moats, retrench, try to save money, protect assets, don't spend, all those things that people do that they think will protect themselves, which are actually the opposite of what we need to be doing. And one more point that I tried to make about unions is that unions are schools of democracy. Unions aren't just things in the workplace. Unions are what teaches people what democracy really is. If you're an American, you hear so much about democracy your whole life, but where do regular people actually experience democracy in their day-to-day lives? You're born, you're in a family. That's not a democracy. That's a dictatorship. You go to school. School is not a democracy. School is a dictatorship also. And then you grow up and you get a job. And a job is not a democracy either. A job is a dictatorship. And so where are we expecting people to have this lived experience of democracy that we talk about so much in the textbooks and stuff? And the answer for millions and millions of people is that their first and usually only lived experience of true democracy is being in a good union, being in a democratic union. That is the only place that millions and millions of people see a democratically run organization building power in a democratic way, acting collectively in a democratic fashion. It teaches people what democracy actually is and gives them a lived experience that allows you to place some value on democracy in the real world and not just as this abstract idea. So I think there's a big civic society payoff for organizing new unions and getting many, many more people into unions. Raising union density is good for civil society in that sense. And you could say that now we're all living through kind of a demonstration of the opposite of that. What happens when people don't value democracy? What happens when people don't have a lived experience of democracy and place little value on that? So Donald Rumsfeld, kind of a bastard, but he had at least one good quote, which was, you go to war with the army you have, not the army you might wish to have. And, here we are with the army we have. Here we are. Higher ed. When I think about higher ed, my industry, the journalism and higher ed, we have some things in common when it comes to organizing people. One thing I think we probably have in common is that it can seem hard to organize in these rooms because these are industries full of people who want to always be the smartest person in the room. And so, I remember when we were trying to organize Gawker, if you said unions are good, there had to be one person to stand up and be like, actually, no, because everybody's got to be a contrarian. So, I suspect that that's true in academia as well. And it can be a pain in the ass. It can be hard sometimes. But, the reality for both of our industries is that we are actually the lowest hanging fruit. We are the easiest places to organize because the easiest demographic of people to organize is well-educated, underpaid people. Those are the people who are the most likely to organize, the most likely to grasp their situation, the most resistant to union busting lies. And so, it was hard as hell to organize the media industry. You all know it's hard as hell to organize in higher ed, but we are we are in fact the low-hanging fruit. We are the easy demographic, and the organizing gets harder outside of these walls. Um, and whenever I'm in rooms like this, I always say, like, if you're wondering who's going to do all this important work of organizing the workers of America and reviving the labor movement, like, look around this room. It's us. It is all of us. There's not a pro-union Batman who is going to swoop in from on top of the building and organize the workers of the world. It is the existing labor movement today that has to produce the better labor movement of tomorrow. And so the work of building and strengthening our unions and giving unions to everybody out there who doesn't have them is on our shoulders. You and me and my union and your union and all of us together. And it's not easy because it requires us to make that leap from collective self-interest, which is what we have inside of our own unions. We have solidarity, but we're included in that group. So it is enlightened self-interest that leads us to build our own unions, to ideological solidarity and a belief that we have a responsibility to all workers, and it doesn't always come naturally. In my union, the Writers Guild, as I said, they were a screenwriters union traditionally. They started organizing journalists. They had a really good run, successful run, organized thousands of journalists. And after a few years of that, some of the traditional members said, we're sure spending a lot of money organizing these new people over here. And then they started looking at the numbers and they were like, these new people over here could become a majority and take over the union. And so we had a big fight about organizing. They shut down the organizing program. There was a backlash, but I was very mad about that. But I have to also admit that this is sort of a natural process that we all have to struggle with, coming to accept that solidarity means more than just our own group. And so it can feel abstract, but at the same time, we have to do that organizing because nobody else will. So, whenever we have a union meeting, I always want to put an empty chair at the table, to remind myself that's a chair for the 90% of workers outside the room who don't have a union. And we have to think about them, and we have to think about representing them same way we think about representing the people inside the room. And so I'm going to stop talking, but I'll read you one of my favorite quotes about the labor movement, and then I'll be happy to take any questions you all might have. But this quote is from Eugene Debs, said in 1904, before he went to prison. He said, 10,000 times has the labor movement stumbled and fallen and bruised itself and risen again, been seized by the throat and choked and clubbed into insensibility, enjoined by courts, assaulted by thugs, charged by the militia, shot down by regulars, traduced by the press, frowned upon by public opinion, deceived by politicians, threatened by priests, repudiated by renegades, preyed upon by grafters, infested by spies, deserted by cowards, betrayed by traitors, bled by leeches, and sold out by leaders. But notwithstanding all this and all these, it is today the most vital and potential power this planet has ever known. And its historic mission of emancipating the workers of the world from the thraldom of the ages is as certain of ultimate realization as is the setting of the sun. Thank you very much.